The shiur is connected to Yud Kislev, Yud Tes Kislev, and Parshas Vayishlach. And in the Kudas HaShir is how the Rebbe the Rebbe demands of us that we should have a mindset, a perspective of Yemos HaMoshiach, even while we're living firmly in Golus or not so firmly in Golus. But since we're living literally and we're experiencing the last moments, we're walking the last mile in Golus in preparation as we walk in to the Geulah. So the Rebbe Bechazdoi HaGadol gives us the lens, the Rebbe's Heilige Augen, with which we should be able to see ourselves, each other, and the world around us through the lens of Moshiach and Geulah, which the Rebbe spoke about B'shaitoi, that the purpose, the reason for us to learn in Yani Geulah Moshiach is because when you learn something, when you learn something slowly, you become acquainted with and familiar with the world view of the Davar HaNilmed, the subject that's being studied. It becomes part of you. Becomes, the Alter Rebbe says, it becomes part of you. And when you learn in Yani Geulah Mashiach, when we immerse ourselves in the studies of Mashiach, we start seeing literally the world, ourselves, our shluchim, our work through the lens of Geulah. So in that light, we'll discuss a topic which is connected to our parsha. Our parsha, Parshas Vayishlach, as many of you may know, has a very unique place in Jewish history. It's brought out in the Medrash, in the Bereshis Rabbah, that Rabbeinu HaKadosh, before he went to meet with the Kaisar and government officials, the royal officials, he would noyeg likrois Parshas Vayishlach koidem shaholach el HaKaisar. He would always read our parsha. In fact, the Ramban writes that it was a Kabbalah among the Geulah Yisrael, that before they visited ministers, kings, leaders of countries, of governments, they would make sure to read, to study unsere Parsha, Parshas Vayishlach. The Ramban writes, "V'Rabboseinu nosnu eitza toiva." They gave us a eitza, and they quote, thank you, they quote, Om Rabbi Yanai kad havesolik lemalchusa, prior to Rabbi Yanai and the Chachamim, before they visited the Nesi HaMalchus, have a mistakel bahadot parshasa. They would study Parshas Vayishlach. In fact, it's known that the Medrash concludes and says that one time Rabbeinu HaKadosh, for whatever reason, forgot, or he didn't learn Parshas Vayishlach before, and Lepoil, after he visited the Kaisar, something terrible happened. He was attacked by a group, a band of thieves of Listim. They stole all his possessions. It was a terrible journey, and he said he was toila, that the reason why this happened because he didn't learn Parshas Vayishlach. In fact, we find in Sfarim, thank you. In fact, we find in Sfarim that this Parshas Vayishlach, is called Parshas Golus, because it's not a Parsha of Golus, it's a Parsha that guides us and tells us how we as Yidden are meant to live in Golus and try to deal with the Golus around us. Parshas Vayishlach is a paradigm that teaches us via Yid daf zugein, daf gucken on the Golus that we live in. The Maril actually brings down that he's the one who brings down that Pam Shochach Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and the Maril Taka writes that it's an inyan to learn Parshas Vayishlach. The Maril himself was noyig this way, and in fact, some people have a minig actually, as we leave Shabbos and we go into Yemos HaChoil and Motzoi Shabbos, it's brought on a minig Yisrael among some to learn every week the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, to see how Yaakov encounters Esav. This is how we're meant to encounter and deal with Golus. In fact, the Be'er Heiter brings in Shulchan Aruch, B'Shem Darizal, we know that those who are nizir not to learn psukim, not to say psukim on Motzoi Shabbos. He says that does not include the limud of Parshas Vayishlach if you're going on a trip that week tripped to the exclusion of Parshas Vayishlach. What's special about Parshas Vayishlach? What do we see in Parshas Vayishlach? So Rabbi say, we're going to examine the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach. We all know that Yaakov Avinu in this moment, in this what you may call a historic moment, Yaakov is about to approach Esav. Vayishlach Yaakov Malachim Lefanov. So we all know the Medrash. The Medrash, Chazal tell us, and Rashi cites it al Asar, that Hiskin, Atzmoi, Yaakov Avinu prepared himself in three ways, right? Yaakov prepared himself l'shloisha dvarim, l'doiroin, l'tfila, u'lemilchama, which means that Yaakov Avinu, as he was marching with his entourage towards Esav, he had three intentions, which, as we'll see, were actually adavar v'hipuchai. On the one hand, he was bringing a gift. Usually when you bring someone a gift, you're not looking to engage them in battle. But here, somehow, in his journey to Esav, he was sai l'doyim, bringing a present, a gift. Sai l'milchama, he was ready to battle Esav. And sai l'tfila. So we're going to use these three examples as a paradigm of how we're meant to look at the Esavs of the world, the Golus of the world, which means we know that what defines Golus, and by definition, what defines Geulah, we know that Golus, in one sentence, in Golus, we're forced to contend with a le'umazeh. In Golus, we're forced to deal with choshech, with klippa, with sitra achra, with forces of negativity, with hisnagdus, with forces and voices that appear to be heipech ha'toira, heipech ha'kedusha, heipech ha'kodesh baruch hu. That's a environment, a product, a mindset of Golus. What's Geulah? Geulah, we all know the Navi Zechariah tells us, V'hoya b'yoyim ha'hu. What will days of Moshiach consist of? Zog the Navi b'shem Hashem, he says, Achris eshmois ha'atzov min ha'aretz. I will annihilate, I will cut off all avodah zarah, any forces of le'umazeh. V'esruach hatuma avir min ha'aretz. So this sums up the quintessential nekuda of Golus and Geulah is, in Golus we're forced to deal with choshech, with le'umazeh. When Moshiach comes, all of that will dissipate. So Rabbi say, in tonight's shiur, we're going to discuss that there are three ways how to deal with, how to contend with, how to address le'umazeh, how to address forces of darkness, voices of choshech, of le'umazeh, of klippa. One way we know is that when a person faces an unyielding force of opposition, a klippe krusha, choshech kafel u'mechupel, what's the eitzah? The only solution we have is milchama. One of the paths that Yaakov took. We have to annihilate, we have to completely subdue it entirely. That's one approach, how to deal with choshech. You might say it's not exactly a Geulah dika approach. When a person's be'oimek hagolus and the forces of le'umazeh refuse to surrender, we have to deal with the choshech. Choshech exists, choshech continues to exist, and therefore we have to fight it, we have to battle it and seek to subdue it entirely. That's one oifen, we'll call it milchama, which is what one oifen Yaakov engaged. Another way to deal with le'umazeh, less of a Golus approach, but still Golus, nonetheless. It's a softer Golus, but not Geulah yet, is softening the harshness of klippa, to neutralize the negativity of choshech, somehow to allow us to coexist with choshech. Zelle umazeh, sometimes the zeh doesn't have to be le'umas zeh. We could somehow coexist with it. We could soften it. There's a way to deal with it. What's the eight? Where do we see that with Yaakov? When you give a matana, right? When you give a gift to someone, so they're not becoming necessarily your best friend. They may not be batel and ganzen, but you're neutralizing, you're diminishing the hisnagdus. You're trying to call attention to goodwill. You're trying to be ma'oider, a toiv leiv, a gutzkeit. Every person deep down has something good in them. You could be ma'oider and give voice to it. That's the second oifen of Yaakov's approach. You can't do away with it altogether, but you're softening it. That's matana. The third way is the Geulah way of dealing with darkness, with le'umazeh is what? Not only do we not have to battle it, not only don't we have to only minimize and reduce it, but we could overwhelm it and transform it, right? Not just fight with it. Adarab, gam oivav yashli imoy. We could take a misnaged and turn the misnaged into a force for kedusha. That is the Geulah approach. That is the ultimate approach, and that is the approach of tefillah. Yaakov took the word tefillah because tefillah has the koyach yehi rotzen, to uftan anaye rotzen, a rotzen chodesh that never existed, to take le'umazeh, to take the forces of negativity and transform it min hara el hatoiv. That is something that's unique, unusual, perhaps unprecedented, but that is a Geulah approach. So these are the three approaches that Yaakov took. L'milchama, that's the lowest approach. Matana l'doiden, to subdue it, to minimize it, to neutralize it. And then there's to transform it in ganzen tefillah. Rabbi Say, there's a story that we all know, connected to Yud Tes Kislev. And I want to share with you three perspectives of how the Rebbe understood this story. We all know that when the Alter Rebbe was released, Yud Tes Kislev, we know that Yud Kislev is the Leida, the birth of Chassidim, and Yud Tes Kislev is the bris. So we're now in the process, the journey towards from Yud to Yud Tes Kislev. And the Alter Rebbe came out of prison on Yud Tes Kislev just when Chassidim thought that the imprisonment was over. We all know the Hemshech HaMaisa, what happened. By mistake, they took the Alter Rebbe to a home, and by mistake, they went onto the wrong floor. They thought they were going to a house of a chassid, and by mistake, they entered into the house of the misnaged. And we know, as the Alter Rebbe later related, that those hours were even worse than the 53 days the Alter Rebbe gesetzen in Turma in prison. So Rabbi Say, I want to share with you three perspectives of how the Rebbe understands, how the Rebbe gives us to understand, how the Rebbe learns this Maisa. And with your permission, let's study it together, and we're going to see how these three oifanim is al derech milchama, doiren, and tefillah. One approach is a Golus approach, one is a less Golus approach, and one is a Geulah approach. And there's three sichos, actually one letter and two sichos. There's a letter from the Rebbe, a letter that is an extremely powerful letter, and I believe it's important for every chassid, especially every shliach in the world, mizman l'zman, to read. Some of you might be familiar with this letter. I want to read you a few lines from this letter that was written in Chav Zayin Shvat Tafshin Yud Dalid. It's printed in Igros Kodesh Chelik Ches. The Rebbe writes to a shliach, I'll read it and I'll translate. Ein lahem li'spol, the Rebbe says, do not be nispol im yesh minagdim al zeh. Don't be nispol if you have opposition in your community, in your shlichus. V'dayoy le'eved liyois kiraboy. You're a shliach of the Rebbe, of the Rabbeim, and you're no better than the Rabbeim. Dayoy liyos kiraboy. Shahoyu minagdim. They had opponents. Hayu minagdim, the Rebbe writes, Alabal Shem Tov, Rabbeinu Azokin, Ukrektushas Admur, Kol Echad B'doyroi. Every Rebbe, every one of the Nesiach Chabad had opponents, had minagdim. Ella, listen to these moeded keverta. Ella shebiyameinu zochinu. Through, in our days we were zoicha. Shal yidei ha-mesiris nefesh shel nesienu hanal. Through the mesiris nefesh of the Rabbeim, v'shabimeyem nizgale v'nisparsem nitzochen achsidis. In their days, the nitzochen, the victory of Chassidus was publicized. Shebemela, listen to these words. Shebemela. Kol hakomim negda, whoever rises up to oppose chassidim, ubahadrochim shel avigdor, and goes in the pathways of the misnagdim, harei zog the Rebbe, takef umiyad nizgala kloinom barabim. They would be embarrassed publicly. Umapolosam bitucha miberoish. Their downfall is certain to happen from the beginning. Here's right there. Ve'im lipa'amim mis'arich ktsas. If it might take some time for the mapola of minagdim, if it might take some time for their true colors to be revealed, if it might take some time for yizgale kloinam barabim, harezeh, writes the Rebbe, ach v'rak mipnei sha'chasidim noisnim lohem tfisas makom. Because we give them a tfisas makom. Because we give them too much attention, too much consideration. Now listen to these last words, which is why I'm bringing this letter. Umikol shekein v'kal v'chomer, sheyadua akama hitzta'e Rabbeinu hazokin, how much the Alter Rebbe was pained mimashashosa kois tei bebeis menagid. How much the Alter Rebbe was mitztair, felt bad, and was upset that he drank that cup of tea in the house of the menagid. Now I ask you, how does the Rebbe understand the story of the Alter Rebbe visiting the house of the misnagid? Would you say the menagid here was begeder milchama, doirin, or tefillah? Huh? Milchama. The menagid's a menagid. The menagid's a menagid. Ad kedei kach, the Alter Rebbe regretted and felt bad and was mitzvah that he drank, that he gave attention, he gave achayis, he gave an esinas makom for this menagid. So this is one approach. One approach how the Alter Rebbe understands this story. The second way to understand this story of the Alter Rebbe visiting the house of the misnagid, which is a little bit moving away from a Golus mindset, closer to Geulah, is the second, after Milchama, is what? Doirin. To try to sweeten Hamtokas HaGvuros, right? To sweeten the harshness of Gvura. To minimize, to neutralize the menagid. The Rebbe in a Sicha in Yud Tes Kislev Tafshel Lamed Ches, HaMoidedik Sicha, the Rebbe speaks about, in the letter that Alter Rebbe wrote after the Geulah, he writes, B'yoim Gimel shehuchpal boi ki toiv yatzasi lecheirus. I emerged from prison on Yud Tes Kislev, Yoim Gimel shehuchpal boi ki toiv. Frag the Rebbe, why is it necessary to write huchpal boi ki toiv? So the Rebbe says, because the Alter Rebbe is teaching us a lesson here. Now when the Alter Rebbe came out of jail, it was on a day, and the idea represents toiv lashamayim v'toiv labrius. As we know, the Alter Rebbe writes in the Geras HaKodesh, Siman Beis, the Alter Rebbe is urging chassidim that lebilti roim levava me'achayam, not to treat the menagdim harshly, l'laharchev aleim peh, or lishrek aleim chaz v'sholem, hasma lahaske ba'az hor noiro. Alter Rebbe, you imagine how some chassidim felt about the misnagdim, how they wanted to treat the misnagdim after the liberation. Alter Rebbe gebeten by Zelle, please. And listen what the Rebbe says in the Sicha Yud Tes Kislev Tafshel Lamed Ches. From this story of the Alter Rebbe visiting the house of the misnagid, learnt men a hayron nifla, which is in the Hascholas HaGeulah. What's a hayron nifla? The Rebbe says, the way the story is told is that a mistake was made, right? The Alter Rebbe was taken out of jail, and the chassidim, the people who took him out from the prison cell, by mistake took him towards the house of the misnagid. Says the Rebbe, "Vi ken tref matos ba'anosi b'Yisrael." How could it be a tos by the Alter Rebbe? Ubifrat, we know that even the meiser, the imprisonment, had to be b'rshusay or b'haskamosi of the Alter Rebbe, right? As we know, the horse and buggy broke down Erev Shabbos because the Alter Rebbe didn't want to go. Everything was done with his haskam or bracha. Muzmin Zagen, says the Rebbe, as the tos is given by the Eden was haben geführt. They made a mistake. Aber chas v'sholem zu sagen, Ados given atos l'mayla chas v'sholim, or the atos l'mata b'al Rebbe. Chas v'sholim said there was a mistake here. This was deliberate. To go to the house of the misnaged was perfectly deliberate. Why? Alter Rebbe, as we know, says the Rebbe, he drank tea in the house of the misnaged. Why did he drink tea in the house of the misnaged? He wanted to show. He didn't only preach to his chassidim, loy laharchiv alayim peh, loy lishrek alayim. He wanted to practice what he's asking his chassidim to do. So he deliberately went to the house of a misnaged, and he sat in the house of the misnaged, and he drank tea in the house of the misnaged to show that even to such a person that was muching and tormenting the Alter Rebbe about nusach tefillah, etc. Nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe found it within himself to be toiv la-shamayim and toiv la-briyas, even to briyas ba'alma, such a creature like this misnaged, to demonstrate to chassidim how we have to show kindness and to be merciful and to behave toiv la-shamayim, toiv la-briyas, even to hazam min beria. The Alter Rebbe says, Toiv at kedikachet, the Rebbe says, "Etzichnid bagnugin der mitvos geschrieben loy laharchav alayim b'lishek alayim." He didn't just write it to his chassidim, but hat alein ba'avizin vias darv zayin di anhoge von toiv labrias. My friends, how do we understand this pshat? How the Rebbe learns the story? Is it milchama, doirin, or tefillah? What would you say? Doirin, right? To evoke, to be ma'oider, a friendship even to one who's in the gather of a menagid. But what happens when you're kind even to a menagid? What happens? You neutralize, you minimize the lu'umazeh, you weaken the forces of choshech. You're not doing away with altogether, but you're minimizing the forces of lu'umazeh. This is the second approach. And by the way, this approach is also well known. We know that in the year Tovkuf Nun Zayin, unfortunately, the misnagdim, when they printed Savos HaRivash, which is one of the first farm that came out from the Baal Shem Tov, came out in print. Unfortunately, misnagdim, they gathered the sefer from as many copies as they can get their hands on, and they made a big bonfire, and they burnt the Sfarim Rachman Litzlan. The Alter Rebbe writes a letter to the Chassidim, and he writes like this: Oidois hasreifa, asher sorfu sefer hayadua. Concerning the fact that the misnagdim burnt Tzavos HaRivash, says the Alter Rebbe to his chassidim, you should know, Loi lochem loriv esriv habal Shem Tov. It's not your mandate, it's not your job to fight the battle of the Baal Shem Tov. Loi zu ha'ir v'loi zu ha'derech, asher chofetz bo Hashem. And he says, listen to these words of the Alter Rebbe, Ach kvar hoye lo ilamim, zichru yemois oilam, he writes, Ki milanu gadol mi Moshe b'doiroi harehu harambam asher ba'artzoi shmoi holach gadol ma'oid. The Rambam was held in an incredible manner. He writes, ba'arotzes harachoikes asher lo shamu v'lo ro es kvoidoi hechziku l'min v'koifer. They consider the Rambam Rahman Tzan to be a min and a koifer. V'sorfu svarov, and they burnt the Rambam Svarim b'rchoivis Kiria in the streets. The Alter Rebbe concludes, Ka'asher cholfu v'ovru yomim rabim, when days passed, the gam sinosam v'chulu, the Alter Rebbe is quoting a pasuk in Koheles, gam sinosam, gam kinosam kvar avoda. Their hate and their envy dissipated altogether. V'titzmach emes me'eretz, v'yodu kol Yisrael ki Moshe emes v'toyrose emes. And he concludes, v'koy yiyelonu b'meheira v'yomeinu amen. But then there were Yidden who burned the Sfarim of the Baal Shem Tov. But a time will come that everyone will embrace the Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi said, we're living in that time today. There's no chug in Klal Yisrael today. There's no community, movement, Eida, Chug, among Yidden, B'chol, Katzvus Tevel, among Kol Adosis Yisrael, that does not hold the Baal Shem Tov in great esteem. We're living today to see these words of the Alter Rebbe be fulfilled b'milui. So this is, it's not Golus, It's not complete Geulah, but it's moving towards a mindset of Geulah. So this middle approach of how the Rebbe teaches the story with the Rebbe being in the house of the misnaged is doidoin. Now I'd like to share with you a different way the Rebbe learned the story of the Baal Shem Tov in the house of the Menaged. The same way that Yaakov Avinu was traveling, and every step he took, the Medrash learns that it meant three things: doirin, milchama, and tefillah. Likewise, in the Alter Rebbe visiting the house of the Menaged, we can look at it also through three ways. One, milchama, igros kodesh, chelik ches, hitztair. He felt terrible that having to give in a sin of smokim. The second was fakert, toiv labrius, and now listen to this. In a Fabreng Yud Tes Kislev Tavshin Chavav, the Rebbe says that Alter Rebbe writes in his letter, Kishakorisi b'sefer Tehillim b'posek Poda v'sholem nafshi yotzasi b'sholem. So the Rebbe, by the Rebbe, everything is precise. Yet the word from the Rabbeim is kodesh kadoshim. Frag the Rebbe, Hainu, if the Rebbe says yotzasi b'sholem, Hainu is the Rebbe shenistayim ha'maisa v'hapidiyah hoyse b'sholem. That means that the imprisonment is completely behind him, and now he's living in a state of Geulah. Shegam ha'mo'oira sheyoshav la'achar zeh kamer shoz b'beis ha'menaged koshur v'shayich l'inyan ha'Geulah. The Rebbe says the fact that Alter Rebbe was forced later to sit in the house of the Menaged a few hours, the Rebbe says that cannot be any type of imprisonment. That must be a part of Geulah. How do you understand the Alter Rebbe sitting in the house of the Menaged being part of Geulah? Listen how the Rebbe explains it. This is Fabreng Yud Tes Kislev Tavshin Chavav. The chiddush of the Geulah of the Alter Rebbe, says the Rebbe, was that Poda b'sholom, that b'rabim hayu imodi. Therefore, says the Rebbe, when the Geulah happened, moments after the Alter Rebbe was liberated from prison, hascholas ha'Geulah v'ikara. You hear this? Let's be medayik in the Rebbe's words. The haschola of the Geulah and the ikar ha'Geulah nizgalsa was revealed and expressed b'diras ha'menaged. You hear this? The Geulah of the Alter Rebbe was primarily expressed and revealed overtly in the house of the Menaged. Ubeoifen shehigrish kibud l'shem ha'Geulah. That the misnaged served the Alter Rebbe a cup of tea to celebrate the Alter Rebbe's Geulah. Here's what the Rebbe learned. That until the Rebbe says that Satam Durgenumen she is battle mitoidas Menaged. Evet ois Menaged. Can you imagine? The misnagdim are celebrating the Alter Rebbe's Geulah. He's serving the Alter Rebbe, part of the Suda Soida. You know where, according to the Sikh, you know where the first Suda of Yud Tes Kislev Chag HaGeulah was? In the house of the Menaged. And you know who served the Alter Rebbe? The Baal HaGeulah, the Menaged himself. There's a chelik from the Geulah. And the Rebbe says, Miyad ba'ascholos HaGeulah. Listen to the Rebbe's words. B'shah she'niftecha hadelas b'diras ha'menaged. When the door opened up to the house of the Menaged, V'ro, and the misnaged saw Rabbeinu Azakin Yotze L'cheiros. He witnessed the Alter Rebbe liberated from prison. Higish like kibud. Hatim dalank ta kibud. He served him. And in this, says the Rebbe, Bol l'dei bitui. In them, Zoktzich Harois is expressed Nekudas HaGeulah Shel Rabbeinu Azakin. Ba'oifin de birabim hayu imodi. Sheharishoin, these are the Rebbe's words. Sheharishoin, the first one. Shehikir be'inyan ha'Geulah, the first one to recognize and to celebrate the Geulah of the Alter Rebbe, the higish kibud l'shem zeh, and serve the Alter Rebbe to celebrate this incredible historic day. Hayozeh sha'adayin ha'ib'mayim with the matzah shel Menaged. It was the Menaged that celebrated with the Alter Rebbe. Rabbi say, this way, how the Rebbe learns pshat is it milchama? Absolutely not. Is it doiden? Afilu nisht. What is it? It's tefillah. It's a Geulah approach. It's the highest form of dealing with l'umazeh. Not only are we not fighting the l'umazeh, not only do we have to contend with it, But the misnaged itself, those who oppose the forces of Kedusha are now celebrating the Geulah. Rabbi Say, Talmidim, we, throughout history, Yidden contended in different ways, dealt with, addressed, confronted Choshech in different ways. For most of history, for most of Jewish history, we were forced to battle, because we couldn't exist. We were being persecuted, barely tolerated by lahavdil goyim and even Yidden. The maskilim, the shabtai, the menagdim, in different every doid had its menagdim from the ummah, from lahavdil Yidden, and sometimes from goyim, and sometimes even Yidden. And the question is, how can we deal with it? For most of history, we had no choice but to fight it. So in some cases, we could have dealt with it boifin shel doidoin. We tried to be nice. You know, most shuls in the world, they made a mishabeirach for who? Every Shabbos? Huh? For the government. They made a mishabeirach, even though the government, they were far from Oyev Yisrael. And they sent gifts to the government, to the Kesar. They sent delegations, they sent gifts. They tried to subdue, to neutralize, to sweeten, to be mantik the gvuros, but it was still Golus. It was Golus, sometimes a little bit less harsh. Today, Rabbi Say, b'doireinu, in this last mile of Golus, in doireinu doir hashvi, the last generation of Golus, and we're certain be'emunah shleima, which will be b'korev the first generation of Geulah. The Rebbe not only teaches, but the Rebbe embodies, and the Rebbe personifies, shows us, teaches us, unhebt uns uf, and gives us the lens to see that there's no such thing anymore as l'umazeh. Any time there's a force of opposition, the Rebbe says, it's meant for Kedusha. Bring him around. Show, and the Rebbe, there's many sikhs and letters and stories. I can't keep you here for much longer, but you know, many of you know the stories. You can share them with me, you can share them with each other. We all know stories how the Rebbe refused to see the negativity of this world. The world today already is marveling at the Rebbe's cook. The Rebbe's cook is becoming slowly nachlas haklal. And the Rebbe refused to see, even among Yidden, even among those who consider themselves to be, quote unquote, menagdim. One of the stories which brings this out very much, a story which many of you might know, that when the Rebbe in Tafshin Lamed Beis, when the Rebbe announced the Ayin Aleph Moisdes, the Rebbe was establishing 71 Moisdes in honor of his 70th Yom Haledes. So the Seder was, as you know, the Rebbe did not determine what these organizations should be. The Rebbe gave criteria, and he asked chassidim, he asked the shluchim that they should be matzia, they should suggest Moisdes based on the criteria, and the Rebbe either accepted or rejected it to be among the Moisdes. He was a Yid in London. Perhaps if the Abachrim here from England, they would know him or certainly his family. His name was Rab Nosson Vogel, otherwise known as Bobby Vogel. He was a Yid, a Gvir, a Yid, a Bal Chesed, a Tayir, a Chassid, a Tayir, a Yid. And this Yid, on his own, Mr. Vogel, Rab Nosson Vogel, was a diamond cutter, a diamond setter, and for many years, he would take chassidishe yingalite, chassidishe, Baba Belze, Satma yingalite, Poilish yingalite, that would get married at 18, 19 years old. They would sit in Geulah for a year or so, and they would need a parnasa. So every year he took a few yingalite, and he taught them the trade. He taught them how to deal with diamonds, how to cut diamonds, how to set diamonds. He taught them parnasa. When he heard about the Rebbe's request, the Ayin Aleph Moisdes, he thought to himself, maybe I should make this a formal moisid. A moisid, a proper organization, and he prepared a whole proposal, and he gave it. He was the Yechidus. I checked the story with his kids. He was on Yechidus. He presented the Rebbe with a whole proposal. The Rebbe reads the proposal. The Rebbe says, "Hagut svares, hagut. It's something you should do, but I'm sorry, it cannot be one of the Ayin Aleph Moisdes. It can't be one of the 71 Moisdes Chabad that are being established." Rabbi Nosson was very taken aback. Here he was about to give the Rebbe a matana, a gift for the Rebbe's Yom Haledes. He put a lot of thought in. He's giving of himself, of his money, of his time, and the Rebbe seemed to reject it. The Rebbe noticed that he was not happy, so the Rebbe said, "Let me explain." And the Rebbe illustrated the following. The Rebbe said, "Imagine as a Satmar young man in London. There'll be a Satmar young man in London who would hear about this new Moisid, and he just got married. He's looking for Parnasa. He'll get on." The Rebbe said, "The ban." Ban is the train. He'll get onto the train in London. In London, they use the train a lot. He'll get onto the train in London. He'll get off at the stop, and he'll come to the building, and he'll see on the building it says Lubavitch. And this young man feel uncomfortable. Satmar and Lubavitch, especially in those years, were very much at odds. They had many, many differences, and there were many issues among them. And the young man would say, feel uncomfortable, and he would not go into the building. He would turn around and take the train back home. Said the Rebbe, "Wie kann ich nehmen auf sich die Achrayes von der Parnasse von a Satmar young man? How can I take on my shoulders the Achrayes of a Satmar young man in London? So make the Moisid," the Rebbe said, "but don't call it Lubavitch. It cannot be one of the Ayin Aleph Moises." And I share this story in particular when I meet with Satmar Chassidim. And I tell them the story because I want to illustrate something. The Rebbe is known as the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But as famously, there was a Yid from Yerushalayim, his name was Rabbi Chaim Rabinovich. He was Mechaber the Sefer, Das Soifrim, Ala Torah. He once came to Yechidus, a Yid, a Yeshalmi Yid, came to the Rebbe, walked out of Yechidus, and he came to the Zelle upstairs, 77, he gave a patch on the bimah. He said, "Rabbi Sai is an Ganovim." Ganovim, what did we do? He said, "Why are you stealing the Rebbe and calling the Lubavitcher Rebbe? He's not the Lubavitcher, he's the Rebbe of Gans Kol Yisrael. Why are you limiting him, calling him the Lubavitcher Rebbe?" Because the Rebbe refuses to see differences and divisions among Yidden. The Rebbe sees the world and urges us and pleads with us to see the world through the lens of Moshiach. And when you look at the world through the lens of Moshiach, there's no chiluk between Yidden. The Rebbe insists that the world is a world of Nigla Kvoid Hashem. And this is the story of how the Rebbe sees the world that we're standing now today. The reason why the Rebbe is urging us to learn Geulah Moshiach is because the Rebbe wants us to be mezaka us with the lens of Geulah. And we see also, we're coming now from Tes and Yud Kislev, right before the Mittel Rebbe was nostalgic, in Tes Kislev, a week before, he said a maimer lahavan inyan lekichas anshe chayil, a maimer that explains the reason why there's a gzeira of Kantonistan, why they were chapping kids away to serve in the Russian army. And the Rebbe later said this maimer famously after Rebbe Lefutifas came out of Russia. And the Rebbe said the reason is, it looks bad, but really the reason is in order to give us a new chayis, a geschmack in Torah mitzvahs. When some kids don't have the opportunity to be Torah mitzvahs, it evokes its a new chayis by them and by all Yidden in the world. So it's not only not a oynesh, it's a chesed milamayla, says the Rebbe. Weiter, the Rebbe sees everything not as milchama, not as doirin, but through the lens of transformation. And I'll conclude, this transformation is something that the Rebbe said in a oifen nifla. The Rebbe shared famously Shabbos Vayeshev, the last time we heard a sicha, Vayeshev Numbeis, where the Rebbe says, we know that France, the Navi says, in Avadia, the Golus hachel hazeh livnei Yisrael at Sorfas. Golus is connected somehow to Tzorfas. Whoever learned in Brinois, I'm sure is familiar with the sicha well, Vayeshev Numbeis. And the Rebbe says over there that France, on the one hand, France is Toikef HaKlippa. France is the ultimate expression of Klippa, which is why the Alter Rebbe was fighting the Levin Nefesh at Kedei Mesiris Nefesh against Napoleon. Not only that, the Rebbe says in the Sikha, the reason B'das Tachten that the Histalkus happened, Chavdala Tevis, because the Alter Rebbe was running away. That's the reason, Kaviyachal, why the Histalkus happened. And he was maftiach the Mittel Rebbe b'shvua that Sarfas will not win, Napoleon will not win the Milchama. Why? because France represents the culture of the ultimate clip of Lu'umazah. And now the Rebbe says, the Frierdiker Rebbe sent shluchim to France, and then he shares something, the Rebbe says something in a sikh which the Rebbe never said before, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this. The Rebbe says that the Iker Shleimus Habirur, you know what caused the Shleimus Habirur of France? Durch the Frierdiker Rebbe Nesidereinu was geschickt, listen to this, geschickt shluchim mibnei beisai. The Frierdiker Rebbe sent shluchim from his family. There's a ha'ara here in the Sikha. B'shloi choyref tzadigimel hisyashvu chakad mushlit v'arabonas hatzitkonis chay mushka b'tzorfas shom doru kishmoyne shonim achnos tavshinal. Do you ever know that the Rebbe said he was sent on shlichus from the Frierdiker Rebbe to France? That the Rebbe says in the Sikha. That the Frierdiker Rebbe sent mibnei beisai on shlichus to France, and over there, welcome dort gelebt kamashonim und oivet gewen avidosam belimud nigle de teure previous teure und dort geschickt kisfei chassidishe wie igres koideshloi der Rebbe prepared hatamim from there und dort sein euch zugeget geworden kamen jonum de tfus. And then the Rebbe says that they were the ones that through these shluchim they broke the klippa of France. They broke this klippa, and we see it through the nigun of and the Geulah is known into the Sikha. We see from here that in our generation, we're living in times that whenever there's anything negative, the way we're meant to deal with negativity through the eyes of Geulah Moshiach is not to battle, not to fight. That was the way of the Amol. Not to fight it, not even to neutralize it, but to transform it, to take every bit of koyach that we have, any type of opposition that we have, and transform it l'kedusha. This is what the Rebbe means. We shall open our eyes, and whenever we see something negative, to see it through the Rebbe's lens, through the lens of Geulah. And Kiyadua, the Rebbe told Harav Garelik, the Rav of Kfar Chabad, when he once pulled up his taxi, pulled up in front of 770, the Rav from Kfar Chabad, the old Rav, and he walked out of the taxi, and as he walked out, the Rebbe is coming out of 770. So the Rebbe looks at him, the Rebbe says, the Rav from Kfar Chabad is angekommen. The Rav from Kfar Chabad arrived. He didn't know where to put himself. He didn't know what's he supposed to say. So he responds and he says, Kfar Chabad will gemerkt sein as schönere Rav. Kfar Chabad could have had a nicer Rav. He didn't know that's what he said. So the Rebbe said, das is totally an eich. That's dependent on you. So Rabbi Say, now that the Rebbe gives us the Rebbe's lens, we are zoicha to wear the Rebbe's lens through learning the Rebbe's Maimorim, the Rebbe's Siches, the Rebbe's Igris. We could see ourselves and the world through the lens of Geulah Moshiach. Kain Tiyalonu will be when not only us, but the world would see it. The Meheira v'yameinu mamish v'malkeinu b'reishenu.